Right, so in this tutorial, I'm going to walk you through a really easy sourdough loaf. This particular loaf is 20% whole wheat and comes in at 72% hydration, so a nice moderate hydration level. There's no autolyse with this particular recipe. Like I said, we're keeping it really simple. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to weigh out the water in the recipe, and then I'm going to add the leaven and disperse it in. It doesn't really matter if if you're a gram or so off one way or another with these ingredients. The important thing is to be right around the percentages listed in the recipe. Now just adding a bit of salt to the water, and then once both the leaven and salt are in there, I'm just going to use my hand to kind of stir that up a little bit, disperse some of that leaven throughout the water, which is going to really just kind of spread the yeast and bacteria out, so that when we mix the flour, we'll get a little bit more even fermentation. So once I've given that a good stir, I'm just gonna add the flour to it to begin hydrating that. Like I said, there's no autolyse with this particular recipe, which is an autolyse is when you hydrate the flour in just water before you add the leaven or the salt to it. The reason I'm skipping that is because it adds just another variable to contend with, and a lot of times for a new baker, it can present a challenge for a number of reasons. Because this recipe has a moderate hydration level, the fermentation is going to be a little bit slower, and so we should have plenty of time to build both strength and extensibility in the dough with the fermentation clock ticking. There's essentially three things that you're doing when you're fermenting bread. Obviously, you're trying to fully ferment the dough, and while that fermentation clock is ticking, you're also trying to build elasticity, which is strength in the dough, and extensibility, which is the ability for it to stretch. So now I'm just incorporating all the flour and water together. The important thing here is just to make sure that you get it fully hydrated, that there's no clumps or dry bits. And then once that's done, I'm just going to cover it, and we're going to leave it alone for an hour. Okay, so that hour is up. So now I'm going to begin developing the gluten a bit in this particular dough. It's had an hour of fermentolyse, which is essentially an autolyse, but with the leaven already added to it. And within that hour, there's going to be very little actual fermentation activity taking place. So that hour has really given the dough a chance to build some extensibility. You can see that it's much more smooth and pliable than it was when we first started with it. Just doing a quick temperature probe on here, and see that the dough is coming in at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, which is right about the target desired dough temperature of 78 degrees Fahrenheit, which I started with. So now I'm just folding the dough in on itself from the outside in towards the center. I guess these are kind of a little stretch and fold, if you will. And then we're moving into actually working the dough itself, trying to build some strength, develop that gluten using a method called the Roubaud method. It's named after Gerard Roubaud, who's a French baker. And essentially, this is just a really gentle way to develop the gluten by cupping your fingers under the dough and moving backwards and forth with a diving motion, sort of pulling up as you're clawing it against the side of the bowl. It's like I said, it's a really gentle method, but it's one that really develops the gluten throughout the whole dough. Here I'm just kind of stretching and turning the dough over itself just to kind of make sure that we're working all of it. And then I'm going to give another couple of minutes working it with the Roubo method. Now I'm also going to show you a different method of developing the gluten early in a bread dough here. This is called slap and fold. So we're just taking the dough with both hands, slapping the sort of tail of it down on the bench, and then folding the top over it, and then turning sort of 90 degrees to grab it and pick it up and repeat it again. Now, you don't have to do both of these methods for developing the gluten. You can just pick one of them. I'm showing both of them in this video because either one is a really suitable way to build a lot of early strength in a dough. I've just put it back in the bowl here, and I'm giving it a little bit more of the Roubo method just to kind of develop that dough just a little bit more before we give it another rest. You can see that it's the dough is really starting to come together. Here I am pulling a bit of a window pane on it. You can see it's just starting to tear a little bit, so that gluten's not fully developed yet, but it's close. It's about 80 or 85% developed. So I'm just going to round it off a bit here, and then we're going to let the dough rest for another hour. So you'll notice throughout this tutorial that I am using a timer for all my steps, but I'm also using my notebook. I've written down my dough formula. I'm noting the temperature of the dough during the various stages, and I'm also writing down each step in the process and the time which I do it. This is really helpful for a new baker, but also for an established baker to have a documented record of exactly the process that you used, the recipe that you used, and the temperature, so that you can replicate your results for subsequent bakes. If you end up with one that you really like, then it's easily repeatable. Okay, so we've skipped ahead that 1 hour rest to the first set of stretch and fold that we're going to do. I'm just getting a bit of water on my hand so that it doesn't stick to the dough. And we're just gonna lift up from underneath the dough, gently stretch upwards, and then fold it down onto itself at roughly 90-degree angles. As I'm doing this, you can see that at this point the dough is still quite granular, and there's sort of striations that form in the dough as I'm folding it over from my fingers. You don't have to work the dough hard here. You just want to make sure that you give it a good stretch each time and fold it over. And I'm just going to use both hands here because it's starting to tighten up a bit, and I want to build a little bit more strength before we let it rest. So I'm just going around one more time. It's important to not tear the dough, but you want to work it until it becomes really tight and sort of resists you working it anymore. And then I'm just going to round it off, pop any little air bubbles that may have formed, because these aren't fermentation bubbles. This is air that will be incorporated from my mixing or folding. And then once it's rounded off, we're gonna let it rest again. Okay, so one of the things that's really important to mention at this point is the importance of resting the dough. Now obviously we're working hard to build both strength and extensibility in it, and we do have the fermentation clock ticking, but it's really important in between working the dough to really give it the time that it needs to fully relax. By letting it fully relax, it's going to be much easier to work with, It's going to be more responsive to the next set of folds, and because it's less resistant, we're less likely to run into some shaping issues or the dough tearing. So now it's been another hour, and I'm just going to do a quick temperature probe on it, and I can see that it's dropped to 74 degrees. And that tells me that the bulk fermentation is going to take just a little bit longer. It might be another 30 minutes, 45 minutes or so than if we had gone at 77 the entire time. I've got a bit more water on my hands, and now I'm going to actually perform a coil fold this time, which is where you lift up from the center of the dough and just kind of fold the edge in, and then turn it around, and we're going to do the same with the other side. I'm just performing another window pane test here, and I'm now seeing that this dough is really pulling a good window pane, so I don't really need to build any more strength in it. This dough is strong enough. So now I'm using these coil folds really just to realign the gluten strands and to really help to build that gluten matrix that's going to trap all the gas, that's going to allow the dough to rise into a really nice loaf in the oven. So now I'm finishing up the coil fold. Again, I'm moving to the last edge here and then folding it over and sort of the edge under the dough. And now just kind of straightening it up a bit, and then we're going to give it another rest. Okay, we're now about 45 minutes of rest in, and I'm gonna give this dough just one more coil fold. Again, don't really need to build any strength in the dough, so I'm gonna be really gentle with it, but I just want to give another fold to kind of build those layers of the gluten network. By doing that, we're getting gluten strands that are pointing in opposite directions with each layer, and it's really just going to help to give a really good shape and form to this loaf. You can see as I'm performing the coil fold that it's really holding its shape better than it did with the first one, and that's really what you're looking for a fully developed dough. So we've got the strength, and now we're looking for the ability for the dough to hold its shape, and it's really looking good at this point. So now the idea is just to give it plenty of rest through the end of bulk. So I'm going to give it at least another 40-45 minutes, and then we'll check it again and determine whether or not it's ready to move into shaping. All right, so given it about 40 minutes, and now I'm just going to assess the dough. I can see that we've got a few little fermentation bubbles that are starting to form. I'm just giving the bowl a shake to see how much jiggle it's got to it. I want to see if the dough's really come alive, and I can see that it really hasn't yet. It's still, although it's smooth and glossy, it's quite putty-like. It doesn't really have that kind of pillowy bounce that shows me that the fermentation has really taken hold. And so I'm going to give this a little bit of another round off, maybe pop a few more bubbles, and then I'm going to give this dough another half an hour before I begin shaping it. Okay, so I just told you that I'm going to let this dough go another 30 minutes or so before I begin the shaping on it. But you may be asking yourself at this point, well, how can I tell that the dough needs a little bit longer? And the truth of the matter is that, this is something that really just kind of comes with time and practice and handling the dough and working with it and seeing the results at the end of it. That's one of the reasons why it's really important to document everything that you do, because when you repeat a recipe, if it's the same flour, same hydration, same temperature, it's really going to take about the same amount of work and about the same amount of time. But one of the things that I'm doing is I am using my senses here, all of my senses, to kind of assess the dough. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like even? And these are things which you'll begin to develop an intuition and a muscle memory for. So now I've given it that extra 30 minutes. I've actually got a bunch of other dough out on the bench here. I was shooting this while I was at work at the bakery, so I'm just kind of fitting this loaf in amongst all my production loaves. But you can see as I'm kind of pulling the dough out now how much more alive it is. It's got a lot more jiggle to it, a lot more bounce. It feels lighter in my hand. It's smooth, but it's no longer glossy. It's got an almost satin finish to it. So now I'm just doing a really gentle pre-shape of it. I'm just kind of using my bench knife to round it off, build a little bit of surface tension in the top of the dough, just popping a little air bubble there, giving it a little pat, and you can see how springy the dough is at this point. And once I've built that little bit of tension, then that's all we're going to do with the pre-shape. We're going to now leave that dough and let it fully relax before I do a final shaping on it. Okay, I've given this dough plenty of time to relax after that initial pre-shape, and now I'm going to do final shaping. I'm just putting a little bit of dusting flour on the top of it before I flip this loaf over. And then once I flip the loaf, I want to make sure that I don't get any flour on that side, because that's my sticky side. And now I'm just kind of gently working the dough out into a roughly rectangular shape, because I'm going to shape this into a batard. So I'm just going to do a letter fold, folding one edge in towards the center and then folding the other edge in, pushing out any little air bubbles that may have formed, and just kind of keeping the dough nice and straight. It's important to keep it even and straight for this roll, where I'm just taking the end and tucking it and then pulling it across several times to build that tension in the top, and then just using my bench knife and my hands to seal that seam on the bottom. And once I've got the shape that I want, and it's got that tension, I'm just gonna give it a little dusting of flour on the top of it before I put it in the banneton for the final proof. Okay, and now it's in the banneton. I'm just going to take a minute to fully seal that seam on the bottom of the loaf to make sure that it's going to keep that tension that I've built up in it. It's going to keep that shape while we do a bit of final proof at room temperature, and then I'm going to put this loaf in the fridge for a cold retard of at least 12 hours, maybe a bit longer. We'll see how it goes. All right, bit of dust and flour on top, and then this is ready to be put to bed for the night. Okay, so This loaf was given 45 minutes of room temperature final proof and then 18 hours of cold retard in the fridge at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, about 4 degrees Celsius. And now it's ready to bake. So I've taken it out of the fridge, putting a little bit of dusting cornmeal on the top of the loaf, similar to a finely ground polenta. That's just going to make sure that it doesn't stick to the peel here. And then I'm going to turn the loaf out onto my peel and give it a score with my lamb. I'm going to score at a pretty shallow angle, about 30 degrees down, pointing towards the center of the loaf. Hopefully this is going to give us a nice ear on it. So now that the loaf is scored, I'm ready to load it into my preheated Dutch oven. I've preheated it for an hour at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see from that smoke that it's quite hot. And so now we're just gonna launch it into the Dutch oven, being careful not to touch any of that cast iron. And once I get the dough loaded in, we'll give it a little bit of a spritz with my water bottle, just to build up a little bit more steam for that bake. And now I'm going to cover it and give it 20 minutes in the oven at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, and now here it is coming out after that first 20 minutes. I'm just gonna take the lid off, and now it's gonna go back in the oven uncovered at 450 degrees Fahrenheit, just to develop the crust on it. Okay, we've got a finished loaf now. It just needs to cool before we can cut into it. So I'm just gonna put it up on the cooling rack here and let it cool for a full 2 hours before I give you guys a crumb shot. All right, so the loaf has now had a full 2 hours to cool, and so here is the real moment of truth. Let's see what it looks like inside. Just giving you a few different angles of the loaf. Some nice blisters on the ear there from that cold retard, and then giving it a slice open, and that's not a bad loaf at all. Pretty open crumb there for a 72% hydration. Looks fully fermented, maybe a slightly large pocket there on the right hand side of it, but overall a really good example of an easy 72% hydration sourdough loaf.